Hey there, come a little closer to the fire. Just close enough to feel the smallest warmth on your hands, but not so close that it wakes you up. Tonight I want to tell you something dark in the gentlest way I know. A story that begins in a cramped room of stone, where 500 ordinary men held pebbles in their palms and decided whether an old barefoot philosopher would keep breathing. A story where a single question could make the proudest citizen feel suddenly unsure, where an unseen inner voice could stop a man mid-step, and where a cup, small as a teacup, waited quietly for its turn. If you enjoy drifting off to these slow, shadowed histories, please like the video and subscribe. It helps this little candlelit corner find the people who need it. Now, let your shoulders loosen, let your jaw soften, as if it is quietly untying itself. Take a slow breath in through your nose, and let it out as if you are fogging a window in winter. You do not have to hold on to anything tonight. You can simply listen. I will carry the details for you, the way a river carries leaves. Imagine, if you were standing here with me, that the room around us is dim and the walls are old stone. The fire makes a gentle sound, not a roar, more like a patient animal breathing. Candlelight trembles in the corners and turns dust into little floating stars. And in that same kind of candlelight, long ago, in the year we call 399 BC, Athens was about to begin a trial that would echo for centuries, even after the voices themselves became dust. The courtroom was not grand in the way later courts would be grand. It did not have polished benches and quiet hallways. It was tight, crowded, alive with murmurs, stone underfoot, a ceiling that held the heat and the breath of too many bodies, people pressed shoulder to shoulder, men of different trades and different tempers, all pulled here by the same magnet. Curiosity, resentment, fear, entertainment, duty, and maybe, beneath all that, the private worry that a city could lose its balance. 500 jurors, not trained judges, not a distant elite, but citizens chosen by lot, as if chance itself were part of justice. Farmers with cracked fingernails, merchants who knew the weight of coin, craftsmen who carried the smell of wood or leather, soldiers who remembered the weight of a shield. A sea of faces, some stern, some bored, some eager as children waiting for a story to start. And the man at the center, he had no scrolls of his own to point to, no carved monument, no list of victories. He was not a general. He was not a wealthy patron. He did not arrive glittering with gold or ringed with bodyguards. He arrived as he always did, with that same stubborn simplicity, like someone who had decided long ago that the world could not purchase him. Socrates. Honestly, I have always found it strange how history chooses its anchors. There were kings in that era, loud and bright and violent, and many of them have blurred into the background like smoke. Yet this man, who claimed to know nothing, would become more enduring than the walls of his own city. Even the great stones of the Acropolis would crumble and be repaired and crumble again, while his questions would keep walking, barefoot, into every century. But on that morning, he was simply an old man of about 70, stepping into a hostile room with the steady gait of someone who had walked a lifetime on rough ground. The air tasted of sweat and limestone. Voices bounced off the walls and came back as a dull roar. Somewhere outside, Athens continued its ordinary business. Vendors calling out prices, children running between columns, water splashing into clay jars. The world did not pause for philosophy. It rarely does. Socrates did not bring his children to make the jurors feel pity. He did not dress up in fine cloth. He did not perform the usual theater of regret. He wore his worn cloak, the one that had seen many seasons. The fabric was rough, and you could imagine how it might scratch at the neck, how it might smell faintly of smoke from 100 small fires. His feet were bare, as if shoes would have been a kind of lie. People had strong opinions about his face. Ancient descriptions say he was short and stocky, with a flat nose, Thick lips, eyes that bulged a little, a belly that did not apologize for existing. Some compared him to the satyrs of myth, those half-wild creatures carved on cups, always grinning. It sounds cruel when you say it quickly, but if you slow down and imagine the face, you can also imagine the way it might soften when he spoke, how ugliness can become irrelevant when a presence becomes calm and bright. You know that feeling when someone says something simple, and for a second the room changes, like the air has been rearranged? Socrates did that with questions. Not loud questions, not angry questions. Often they began as gentle as a fingertip tapping a table. What makes a person wise? He could ask that in the marketplace, under the open sky, with pigeons hopping near spilled grain, with the smell of olives and fish and dust in the sun. And within minutes, the confident man in front of him would feel as if the ground under his certainty had turned to sand. That was the strange thing. The question sounded harmless, almost childish, yet it could tie a politician into knots. It could make a poet blush. It could make a craftsman suddenly look away, as if he had seen his own reflection and did not like it. Some people loved him for this. The young, especially, loved him. They loved the way he could puncture a speech with a single calm inquiry. They loved that he did not bow to status. In a city obsessed with reputation, he treated a slave with the same patience as a general. That is intoxicating when you are young, and it is unsettling when you are old and invested. Others hated him. They called him a troublemaker, a corrupter, a man who poisoned the youth, a man who did not respect the gods, a man who made fathers seem foolish in front of their sons. And in a city that had recently been bruised by war and tyranny and fear, any force that loosened the old bonds could look like a threat. So the courtroom filled, and as the morning moved, the prosecutors spoke first. 3 citizens had brought the charges: a young poet named Miletus, a politician and leather merchant named Anytus, and a man named Lycon, who stood for the orators Socrates had often embarrassed. Their accusations were shaped like nets, wide enough to catch almost anything. They said he was impious, that he did not honor the gods of Athens. They said he corrupted the young men who followed him. Those words, impiety, corruption, they sound heavy even now, after so many centuries. They sound like stones dropped into water. The room listened. Some nodded along. Some folded their arms. Some watched Socrates with the kind of bright attention people give to a man on the edge of a cliff. And when it was his turn to speak, many expected one of 2 things, either pleading or defiance. A performance. What they got was something else, a conversation, a questioning. Instead of begging, Socrates began to ask his accusers what they meant. He treated the trial itself like one of his dialogues in the agora. He pushed gently, persistently, as if he were turning a small stone in his fingers to see where the cracks were. "Who improves the youth if I corrupt them?" he asked. And when the answer came back, too broad, too confident, he offered an image so ordinary it felt almost funny in that tense room. Horse training. Would you say everyone improves horses and only one man harms them? Or does it require knowledge, skill, careful hands? If that is true for animals, how much more true for young minds? You can picture the jurors shifting, some frowning, some smiling despite themselves. In that moment, the air in the courtroom would have tightened and loosened at the same time, like a cord being pulled and then released. He did the same with the religious charge. How could a man be accused of believing in no gods, and at the same time of introducing new divine beings? The accusation contained its own contradiction. Socrates did not shout this. He simply asked, and waited, and let the logic do its quiet work. It is almost eerie, the calm of it. A man facing death, and he is still curious, still patient, still interested in the shape of an argument. But the most intimate moment of his defense was not about logic. It was about a memory and a riddle given by a god. He told the courtroom about a friend named Cherifon, an eager man who once traveled to Delphi, to the oracle of Apollo. Delphi was not like Athens. It was a place of mountain air and stone steps worn smooth by countless feet. A place where smoke from offerings clung to columns, and where the priestess spoke in riddles that could guide kings or ruin them. Cherifon asked the oracle a simple question. Was anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle answered, no. Socrates said he had been baffled by this because he did not feel wise. He did not feel gifted with special knowledge. He did not feel like a man who could lecture the city. If anything, he felt like someone standing in a room full of closed doors, holding no key. So he did what he always did. He investigated. He went to those Athens called wise, and he asked them to define what they claimed to know. Politicians, first. Men who spoke of justice and courage as if they had weighed them and measured them and stored them on shelves. Yet, when he asked what justice was, the answer wobbled. When he asked what courage was, it slipped through their fingers. Poets, next. Men whose words made the city weep and swell with pride. But when Socrates asked what their verses meant, why this line was true and that image mattered, they could not say. They created beauty by inspiration or habit, but they did not hold the knowledge of their own craft in their conscious hands. Craftsmen, last. And here, Socrates admitted, he found something solid. A shoemaker knew shoes. A blacksmith knew metal. A carpenter knew wood. Real knowledge. Practical, honest. Yet even here, there was a shadow. Because they knew one thing well, many assumed they knew everything. They carried their expertise like a lantern and believed it lit the whole world. From this, Socrates reached the conclusion that would become his quiet curse and his quiet gift. The oracle was right, but not because he had more answers than anyone else. It was because he was the only one willing to admit how many questions remained. He knew he did not know. That sounds simple when you say it quickly, but if you let it settle, it is a strange kind of wisdom, almost like standing at the edge of the sea at night, knowing the water goes farther than your eyes can follow, and still feeling calm. This was the life he had lived for decades, days in the agora, asking and listening, letting people discover their own contradictions. He called it a kind of midwifery of the soul, though the city did not always appreciate being guided into intellectual labor. And all of that, all those years of dust and sunlight and questions, had led him to this tight stone room, to this moment where the city that prided itself on wisdom would decide whether wisdom itself was safe. If you listen closely, you might hear two sounds at once: the courtroom noise, like distant surf, and beneath it, something quieter, the soft scratch of a pebble against skin, the jurors holding their votes, the future balanced on small stones. Socrates kept speaking, calm, unhurried, as if time belonged to him, even now. And somewhere, perhaps, that mysterious inner sign he spoke of, his daimonion, hovered like a small cold breath near his ear, not pushing him forward, only warning him away from the wrong step. The votes were not cast yet, not in this moment of our telling. For now we can stay on the threshold, where dust floats in a shaft of light, and the old philosopher stands with bare feet on stone, and Athens holds its breath, just for a little longer, before the pebbles fall and the next chapter begins. There is a particular hush that comes before a communal decision. It is not silence, exactly. It is the quiet rearranging of bodies, the clearing of throats, the small scrape of a sandal, the soft thump of a staff against stone. A man rubs his thumb over the edge of his voting pebble as if it were a worry stone. Another juror stares at a crack in the wall, following it upward the way you might follow a river on a map, thinking of anything except the weight of what he is about to do. Outside, you could almost imagine the city breathing. The long war years had left their residue in every alley, in every household. People had learned how fast order could collapse, how quickly the familiar could become strange. Even a courtroom could feel like a kind of battlefield. Only the weapons were words, and the wounds were invisible. Socrates, standing there, seemed to accept that invisible danger, the way he accepted cold or heat, as simply part of the day. He did not promise the jurors comfort. He did not offer them an easy story where everyone was innocent and everyone was wise. He offered them a mirror, and mirrors are not always kind. And still, his tone was gentle, almost tender, as if he were speaking to the city the way a man might speak to a friend who is frightened and pretending not to be. The pebble will fall later. For now, let it rest in the juror's palm like a small cold moon. We can step away from that courtroom for a while and let the story drift backward, the way smoke drifts toward a ceiling beam, curling and thinning until it becomes almost nothing. Socrates did not begin as a legend. He began as a child in a city that believed it was waking into greatness. Around 470 BC, give or take a few years, Athens was bright with construction dust. You could walk near the Acropolis and taste limestone in the air. Chisels rang, not loudly, but steadily, like patient clockwork. Blocks of marble waited in the sun. The Parthenon was not yet the finished, perfect thing we picture. It was becoming, rising, each day adding another layer of stone, another measured line, another shadow that would fall a certain way in the afternoon. Democracy, too, was becoming. It was imperfect, limited, loud. Men argued in the assembly. Voices overlapped. Votes were taken. The city told itself a story about freedom, and even when that story was uneven, it had a strange power. Plays were performed that made people cry in public. Poets were treated like channels for the gods. Historians began to stitch the past into a pattern people could recognize. And somewhere in all of that, in an ordinary household, a baby arrived. His father was Sophroniskus, a stone cutter or sculptor, a man who worked with his hands. Try to imagine the feel of that work. The early morning air, cool on the skin, the first touch of marble, cold as water. The sound when metal meets stone, that sharp ring, followed by the softer rain of dust. You rub your fingers together afterward, and the powder clings, pale and fine, and the lines of your palm fill with it. It does not wash away easily. It lingers, as if the stone wants to leave a trace of itself on the living. His mother was Phainarete, a midwife, different work, but also work of hands and patience. A room lit by oil lamp, the smell of warm water, herbs, sweat, the long hours where time is not measured by sun or clock but by breath, by contractions, by the moment someone grips your wrist because they need to borrow your steadiness. A midwife does not create the life. She helps it come into the world. She listens. She asks questions that matter. She waits for the right moment. Socrates would later talk about these two occupations as if they were symbols carved into the foundation of his own mind. The stonecutter removes what is unnecessary to reveal what was hidden. The midwife helps bring forth something already carried within. Honestly, I have always liked that image. It is simple, almost domestic, and yet it contains a quiet revolution. It suggests that wisdom is not a gift dropped from the sky into a select few minds. It suggests that truth can be revealed by careful removal, by patient attention, by asking the right question at the right time. As a boy, Socrates would have moved through streets that smelled of olive oil and clay and sweat. Athens was a city of stone and sound. There were narrow lanes where water trickled from fountains into basins, and wider spaces where the marketplace opened like a stage. Merchants hawked their wares with throats trained for shouting. Politicians practiced speeches the way athletes practiced throws. Animals wandered where they were not supposed to wander. Dust rose with every footstep and settled again, soft as flour. He likely received the education of a citizen, reading and writing, the poems of Homer, music, athletic training. Even if he grew into a man who questioned everything, he would have been raised on stories that tried to answer everything. The gods in those poems were close, moody, quick to bless and punish. Heroes were praised for victory and glory. A boy could absorb those values the way cloth absorbs smoke, without even noticing. Some later stories claim Socrates started as a sculptor like his father, that people could point to statues he carved. We cannot be sure. It is debated. Ancient lives are always a little blurred, like a face seen through water. But it is easy to imagine him, younger, shoulders stronger, standing near a block of stone, with a tool in his hand, learning how much pressure is enough, how a single wrong strike can crack what you meant to shape. And perhaps that early training taught him something about minds, how a thought, once cracked, cannot be made whole again. How careful you must be, and also how brave. Athens, though, did not allow its citizens to stay only with their tools and songs. War arrived, and war has a way of reaching into every home. When Socrates was in his 30s, the long conflict between Athens and Sparta began, the Peloponnesian War, a grinding struggle that lasted nearly 3 decades. It was not distant. It was not fought by strangers far away. Every citizen could be called to serve. That meant armor, shield, spear, the weight of bronze on the shoulders, the rub of straps against skin, the smell inside a helmet, hot metal and old sweat, the sound of many feet moving together, the earth vibrating with a formation. If you were standing there with me, you might hear the sea in the distance and the rattling of gear in the morning. You might see men adjusting their cloaks, fingers stiff with cold, eyes trying not to show fear. The wars of ancient Greece were not always the sweeping cinematic scenes we imagine. There were long waits, boredom, hunger, the ache of carrying things for miles. Then, sudden confusion. Then, afterward, the quiet aftershock where you sit and realize the world has changed by a few degrees. Socrates served as a hoplite in several campaigns. Accounts say he did so with discipline and calm, and that he showed a kind of endurance that made other soldiers stare. He could go without food longer than most. He could handle cold nights with the same steady expression. At Potidaea, some stories say he saved a young man named Alcibiades, carrying him from danger and letting the younger man receive the glory. At Delium, when an Athenian force broke and men ran, Socrates reportedly walked away in order, helping to cover the retreat. Again, we only have fragments, filtered through later writers, through memory and admiration. Still, the shape of the picture matters. He was not only a man of words, he was also a citizen who had felt the weight of a shield and the silence after shouting. War also changed Athens itself. It changed the tone of the marketplace. It made people quicker to accuse, quicker to fear, quicker to cling to tradition or to abandon it. And then, as if war were not enough, a plague struck the city, killing many, even the statesman Pericles. Imagine the streets then, the smell of smoke from funeral pyres, the hush in doorways, the way people might avoid eye contact, as if gaze could carry sickness. Traditional piety weakened. People asked why the gods had allowed such suffering. Some became reckless. Some became numb. In that unsettled world, Socrates began to turn inward and outward at once. Outward into conversation, inward into a strange sense of being guided. He spoke of a daimonion, an inner sign, not a voice that gave him instructions like a commander, but something that warned him away from certain steps. A small interruption, a quiet no. Some people laughed at this. Some people were unsettled by it. We can't be sure what it was. A religious experience? A habit of conscience? A way of speaking about intuition? Whatever it was, it became part of his legend and part of his own understanding of his life. And then came the moment that he himself treated as a turning point, the kind of moment that feels like a stone dropping through water and leaving rings that spread outward. A friend of his, Sheriffon, energetic and bold, traveled to Delphi. Delphi again, that place of mountain air and smoke and prophecy. I always picture the approach as slow, as if the path itself asks for patience, feet on uneven stone, wind that smells of pine, distant goats, the sound of one's own breathing becoming louder in the thin air, then the sanctuary, and the waiting, and the hush before words. Sheriffon asked the oracle, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle answered, "No one." When Sheriffon returned with this, Socrates did not celebrate. He did not puff up with pride. He said he was confused because he knew himself. He knew his limits. He knew how many things lay outside his understanding. How could the god say he was the wisest when he felt so ordinary? That question became a kind of gentle obsession. It pushed him out into Athens like a current. It made him test the oracle the only way he knew, by asking people what they claimed to know, and listening until the words began to wobble. If you listen, you can almost hear the shift. The moment a craftsman stops talking and starts thinking. The moment a politician's confident speech catches on a contradiction. The moment a young man realizes that the world is not as solid as he assumed, and that this is frightening and thrilling at the same time. Picture him on one of those mornings, not yet the condemned man, simply a figure moving through Athens as the day begins. The stones of the street hold a memory of coolness from the night. His bare soles feel the unevenness, the tiny sharpness of gravel, the smoother patches worn by thousands of passing feet. A thin wind slides along the alleyways and tugs at the edge of his cloak. He pauses, not because he is tired, but because he is listening to the city, to his own thoughts, to that inner warning that sometimes arrives like a hand on the shoulder. He passes a potter's stall where wet clay sits in bowls, dark and shiny, smelling of river water. He passes baskets of figs, their skins split a little, sweet perfume rising. He passes a fountain where water falls into stone with a steady, calming rhythm. The agora is already awake. Even when Athens is frightened, someone still needs bread. Socrates stops where people naturally gather, near a column that throws a clean slice of shadow onto the ground. A man is speaking there with the confidence of someone who enjoys the sound of his own certainty, explaining what courage surely means, what justice surely requires. Men nod. A young boy watches from behind his father's elbow, learning what it looks like to sound important. Socrates waits until the speaker takes a breath. Then he steps forward with something almost polite. When you say courage, what is it? The speaker offers a definition, neat and pleasing. Socrates nods as if grateful, as if he is being taught. Then he asks another question, and another, each one like a soft tap on a clay pot. At first, the pot rings firm. Then there is a faint dullness, a place where the clay is thinner than it should be. Sometimes the speaker grows irritated. Sometimes he laughs. Sometimes he insists Socrates is twisting words. Socrates does not raise his voice. He does not hurry. He lets silence do part of the work. He lets the crowd feel the discomfort. He lets the young boy notice that adults can be unsure. This is how a reputation forms, not through a single dramatic act, but through repeated small moments, repeated shocks to certainty, repeated invitations to admit ignorance. Young men began to hover nearby, drawn to the calm audacity of it. They carried his questions home and tried them out at dinner tables, sometimes with clumsy pride, and that only made the older men bristle. Socrates did not set up a school. There was no fee, no tidy curriculum. He simply talked, and people listened, and some people followed him, as if following a strange kind of music. All of this, the war, the plague, the shifting politics, the buzzing city, formed the soil in which his central conviction grew. He began to speak more and more about the soul, the unseen part of a person that cannot be measured by wealth or applause. And every time he asked a citizen to define justice, he was quietly asking whether Athens itself was just, whether its choices in war were brave or reckless, whether its rituals were pious or empty. You can see why some people began to watch him the way you watch weather, not because it is evil, but because it can change everything. So, as the city sweated through war and plague and uncertainty, Socrates began his long wandering investigation. Politicians first, then poets, then craftsmen. Day after day, the same simple cloak, the same bare feet on rough stone, the same calm curiosity. The method was not yet a name, it was simply what he did. And the strange thing is, each conversation made him a little more famous and a little more disliked. Because when you pull at the loose threads of a society, you do not only unravel lies, you also unravel comfort. In the next part, we will follow him into the agora, where sunlight falls on marble columns and dust hangs in the air like pollen, and we will watch him ask the kind of questions that cannot be taken back, questions that would gather young followers like moths to a lantern, and gather enemies like storms on the horizon. Tonight, let us return to the agora, but not as a crowd rushing through it. Slow it down. Let it become almost still, like a painting that only breathes when you look closely. Imagine the sun is low enough to soften the marble, turning it warm and pale, and the shadows stretch in long, quiet bars across the ground. The stones underfoot have been smoothed by countless souls. They hold heat in the afternoon, then release it as evening approaches, as if the city itself exhales. Socrates moves through that space the way water moves through reeds, not pushing, not forcing, simply finding the gaps where a conversation might begin. His cloak shifts against his knees with each step. A thin line of dust clings to the hem. Bare feet, always bare feet, meeting the roughness of the street without complaint. Some people glance at him and smile, as if he is part of the scenery now, like a familiar statue. Others look away quickly, as if eye contact might invite a question. And questions were his way of touching the world. He did not deliver speeches the way politicians did. He did not perform poetry in the way the rhapsodes did. He did not claim an expertise that could be bought and sold. He stood close enough to hear a person breathe, and then he asked, "What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? What is friendship?" At first, these words seemed so ordinary, almost too small for all the attention they received. Yet, in that marketplace, with olives and fish and clay bowls and gossip all mixing in the air, those questions could feel like a stone dropped into a calm pond. You would not see the bottom, but you would see the rings spreading. People often began with confidence. They had been citizens of Athens their whole lives. They had heard these words spoken in assemblies, sung in plays, shouted on battlefields. Of course they knew what justice was. Of course they understood courage. And Socrates would nod, as if grateful, as if he were the student, as if he were simply hungry to learn. You know that feeling when someone listens to you so closely that you start to hear your own words differently? That was part of his method, and it was almost uncanny. He would repeat a phrase back to you slowly, letting it hang, letting you feel its weight. Then he would ask for a small clarification. Do you mean justice is obeying the laws? All laws? Even bad ones? And what makes a law bad? No accusations, no raised voice, just a gentle hand turning the thought around, looking for the seam. A seam would appear, then another. The conversation would tighten and loosen, like a rope being tested. And eventually, there was that moment the Greeks had a name for, aporia, a kind of thoughtful stuckness, a productive confusion, a person realizing, with a flush of heat in the face or a sudden dryness in the mouth, that they did not know what they thought they knew. Some people hated that moment. They felt exposed. Even if Socrates never meant to humiliate them, they would storm away, muttering that he was playing games. They would tell their friends he was dangerous. They would remember the sensation the way you remember being laughed at, even if no one laughed. Others felt something else, relief. Strangely, the relief of honesty, the relief of putting down a heavy bundle of certainty and admitting it had been borrowed. Those people often stayed. They leaned in. They tried again. They let themselves be guided into that uncomfortable beginning where real thought can grow. Socrates called his work a kind of midwifery. He was not planting ideas in other minds, he insisted. He was helping them give birth to what was already inside, hidden beneath layers of habit and pride. And because he framed it that way, he did not sound like a conqueror. He sounded like someone offering help. Yet help can feel like an insult when it arrives uninvited. Day after day, the pattern repeated. A confident statement, a gentle question, a definition offered, then revised again. A contradiction emerging like a hairline crack in pottery. The crowd shifting, drawn in by the strange intimacy of watching another person think in public. In a city that adored performance, Socrates turned thinking itself into a kind of performance, though he would have disliked that description. He was not trying to entertain. He was trying to wake people up. He once compared himself to a gadfly, a small stinging insect sent to bother a large lazy horse. Athens, he implied, was that horse, strong, proud, sleepy in its assumptions. He did not sting with cruelty. He stung with questions. And somewhere inside him, he said, there was another presence, the daimonion, the inner sign. It is hard to describe without making it sound like a simple superstition, but if you slow down and imagine it as he might have felt it, it becomes more human. A small hesitation that arrives without warning, a quiet interruption, a sense of wrongness when he is about to say yes to something that would compromise him. It did not tell him what to do. It only told him what not to do. Some Athenians heard this and thought he was introducing new spiritual beings, meddling with unseen forces. Some thought he was simply speaking poetically about conscience. We cannot be sure, but Socrates was sure enough to trust it, and that trust shaped his life. It is strange to think of a whole legacy balanced on something as subtle as a hesitation. The youth of Athens gathered around him like moths around a lamp, not because he promised them comfort, but because he treated them as minds worth speaking to. In a world that measured worth by birth and wealth and age, he offered a different scale. Plato, the aristocratic young man with a future in politics, came and listened. You can almost picture him, clean cloak, careful hair, standing among the crowd with an expression that shifts between admiration and shock, as if a door has opened inside him. Xenophon, a soldier and practical thinker, came too, drawn by the steadiness of Socrates, the way he could face a question, the way a soldier faces a road, step by step. And then there was Alcibiades, brilliant, beautiful, reckless. He had the kind of charm that makes a room tilt toward him. He had wealth, family, ambition, and a taste for attention. Athens adored and feared him at once. Socrates and Alcibiades together became a kind of living riddle for the city. The ugliest man and the most beautiful man, the most disciplined soul and the most undisciplined appetite. People watched them the way they watched storms over the sea, fascinated and uneasy. Alcibiades wanted Socrates in more than one sense. He wanted his approval. He wanted his attention. He wanted to be seen by him as someone capable of virtue. And Socrates, with his strange confidence that every soul has a spark worth tending, tried to turn that wanting into something steadier. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. Alcibiades could admire Socrates deeply and still choose the bright path of ambition. He could confess his weakness and then chase pleasure again the same night. That tension, that almost tragedy, hung around them like perfume. If you were standing near them in the agora, you might see Alcibiades laughing, gesturing, making the crowd smile, and then suddenly quieting when Socrates speaks, as if a colder, cleaner air has entered the space. And you might see Socrates, unhurried, looking at the young man with a gaze that is not dazzled, a gaze that asks, without saying so, who will you become when applause is gone? This was the quiet danger of Socrates. He did not tell young men how to win. He asked them what winning even meant. And so, households felt the ripple. A father hears his son returning from the marketplace with new questions and a strange brightness in his eyes. The son asks at the dinner table what justice is, what virtue is, why reputation matters. The father feels his authority wobble, not because he is a tyrant, but because he has never needed to explain himself this way. It is easy to imagine irritation growing like mold in damp corners. Socrates did not help himself by refusing to play the normal games of respect. He would speak to a wealthy man as if wealth meant nothing. He would speak to a respected politician as if the man were simply another citizen with ideas to test. In a society of rank, this was unsettling. And he did not charge money. This is important and also odd. Athens had professional teachers, sophists, who would train young men in rhetoric and argument for a fee. They were often clever, often successful, and often accused of teaching tricks rather than truth. Socrates refused that path. He said wisdom should not be bought. He said he was not a teacher selling knowledge. He was, if anything, a companion helping others clear away illusion. It earned him admiration, and it also created a practical problem. How did he live? How did he feed his household? Some say he inherited enough to live modestly. Others say wealthy friends sometimes offered support. We cannot be sure. But we do know he lived simply. Little furniture, few possessions, a kind of deliberate poverty that was not romantic, just chosen. And in that small household life, another figure appears, often in jokes and sharp stories. Xanthippe. Later writers paint her as endlessly nagging, shrewish, frustrated with a husband who spent his days in public conversation instead of earning money. It is a tempting caricature, and caricatures stick because they are easy. But if you slow down and imagine the reality, it becomes less funny and more human. A woman married to a man who refuses the normal paths. A woman raising children in a city strained by war, plague, politics. A woman hearing neighbors whisper that her husband is a corrupter. A woman watching him walk out the door barefoot again, cloak thin against the wind, while she stays behind with the daily labor of bread and water and clothing and worry. If she was sharp-tongued, perhaps it was because someone had to be sharp. Someone had to speak the practical truth that the city did not pay philosophers in compliments. Socrates, for his part, seemed to treat even domestic friction as another place to practice virtue. He joked that marrying a difficult partner was like learning to ride a spirited horse. If you can manage that, all other mounts seem easy. It is a strange joke, not kind exactly, but it reveals something. He turned everything into an examination. Even his own home was a workshop of character. They had sons, 3 of them, according to tradition. The youngest still a child when Socrates would face the end. That detail sits quietly in the background, like a small candle that you forget is burning until you notice it again and feel a soft ache. Meanwhile, the city itself was growing harsher. The Peloponnesian War dragged on. Athens, once proud of its ideals, began to do things that unsettled even its own conscience. Allies became subjects. Enemies were treated with cold logic. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. A phrase that still chills when you let it settle. In that atmosphere, Socrates' questions were no longer merely philosophical. They became political without needing to be, because asking what justice is, during a war that tests justice, feels like a critique. And yet, Socrates insisted he was loyal, a patriot even. He served as a soldier. He obeyed laws, even when he disliked them. He did not plot coups. He did not run for office. Some say his inner sign warned him away from public life, as if it knew the city would not tolerate his kind of honesty within its machinery. Still, suspicion gathered. People began to associate him with the young men who followed him, and some of those young men, brilliant and dangerous, would go on to harm Athens in ways that would make the city remember Socrates with bitterness. It did not happen all at once. Like many tragedies, it built slowly. A conversation here, a joke there, a memory of embarrassment, a political wound, a sense that the old ways were slipping. So as evening falls over the agora, and the vendors begin to pack their wares, and the smell of smoke starts to appear as homes light their small fires, Socrates remains, still talking, still asking, still drawing a circle of listeners in the fading light. The questions do not stop. They never stop. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the crowd, a few older men watch with narrowed eyes, as if they are measuring the distance between a question and a catastrophe. In the next part, we will follow the city as it breaks and watch how a teacher of questions becomes tangled in the city's wounds, not by force, but by association, by memory, by fear. And by the way, a frightened democracy tries to protect itself. There is a particular smell that lingers after a long war. Not only smoke, though there is always smoke, but something drier. Dust ground fine by years of marching. Old sweat sunk into leather. The faint metallic tang of fear that never fully leaves a place once it has been invited in. Athens carried that smell in its streets as the Peloponnesian War staggered toward its end. The city that had once felt bright and confident began to feel tired, watchful, easily startled. Even the sunlight on marble seemed harsher, as if it revealed too much. Socrates kept walking, kept talking, kept asking. He did not retreat into silence when the city grew tense. If anything, tension made his questions sharper, not in tone, but in relevance. When you live through crisis, words like justice and courage stop being decorations. They become urgent. They become dangerous. It is easy to imagine him pausing near a fountain where water falls into stone with steady patience. The sound is soothing, almost like breath. He listens to it for a moment, perhaps letting his mind settle. Then he turns back to his companions and asks softly, what does it mean to live well when the city itself is losing its way? He spoke often about the soul. Most Athenians, like most people in most eras, were drawn to visible things. Wealth you could count, reputation you could taste in applause, physical pleasure, political power, the body and its comforts, the city and its honors. Socrates inverted that scale, as calmly as if he were turning a clay cup upside down. He said the soul mattered more than the body. He said virtue mattered more than victory. He said it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it. And he said something even more unsettling. Virtue is knowledge. You might hear that and feel confused. It sounds too neat. But he meant something specific, and he meant it stubbornly. If a person truly understood what was good, not as a slogan, but as something real in the depths of their mind, then they would do it. No one does wrong willingly, he claimed. People do wrong because they are mistaken about what is truly good for them. They trade the lasting for the immediate. They confuse the sweet taste of applause with real worth. Some scholars argue about how Socrates meant this, about how much he really believed it, about whether it was more a provocation than a doctrine. We cannot be sure. Yet the idea itself, spoken out loud in a wounded city, had consequences. If virtue is knowledge, then those who govern should know what justice is. If they do not know, then what are they doing with power? If tradition cannot explain itself, then why should a young person obey it? If a man claims authority, but cannot define the terms of his own authority, why should he be followed? You can see how this would feel like a slow earthquake under Athens. Socrates was not giving speeches calling for revolution. He did something subtler. He taught people to ask for reasons. And when people begin to ask for reasons, the old spell of authority weakens. In calmer times, Athens might have tolerated that. In war and trauma, tolerance shrinks. Fear makes a society want clean lines, simple stories, clear enemies. Athens had suffered humiliations. Its mighty fleet diminished, its empire dissolved. The long walls that had once symbolized security were torn down, and then came the political wound that never fully healed, the 30 tyrants. After defeat, Sparta backed a brief oligarchic regime in Athens, a group of 30 men who ruled with cruelty and suspicion. The reign did not last long, only months, but it was enough to change the city's nervous system. Executions, confiscations, neighbors watching neighbors, people learning to speak carefully, to keep their thoughts private, to survive. When democratic government returned, the citizens were determined to protect it, almost obsessively. They wanted stability. They wanted the old order back, or at least something that felt like order. They wanted to make sure no one could unravel the city again. And this is where the shadow around Socrates darkened. It was not only his questions. It was the company he had kept. Critias, once part of his circle, became one of the 30, one of the men whose names would taste bitter in Athenian mouths. Alcibiades, that bright, reckless star, betrayed Athens more than once, shifting alliances, chasing ambition like a scent. Other young men associated with Socrates were linked, fairly or unfairly, to anti-democratic schemes and scandals. Was it Socrates' fault? It is debated. He did not command them. He did not hand them knives or voting pebbles. He asked questions. He tried, perhaps, to guide them toward virtue. But a city in pain does not always make fine distinctions. It gathers symbols. It gathers scapegoats. It gathers stories that explain its wounds. Socrates also had his own habits that critics could twist into threats. He rarely participated in the assembly the way other citizens did. He did not chase office. He sometimes criticized the practice of selecting officials by lot, suggesting that important roles should go to those with knowledge rather than those chosen by chance. He used an analogy that would stick in people's minds. The state as a ship. Would you choose the captain by lottery or by expertise? It is a simple image, and because it is simple, it is dangerous. It suggests that democracy itself might be foolish. Whether Socrates meant it as a final statement or as a question to examine became irrelevant in a fearful atmosphere. And then there was his daimonion again, that inner sign. Some heard it and thought it meant he was introducing new divine beings, a private cult. Others thought it made him unpredictable. A man guided by something unseen can be terrifying to those who prefer rules they can touch. At the same time, he continued to embarrass people in public conversation. He continued to expose ignorance in men with reputations. He continued to inspire youth. You can feel the resentment building, not as a single flame, but as many small coals. A man who once felt like a harmless eccentric begins to look like a threat. A gadfly becomes, in frightened imagination, a wasp. A question becomes a weapon. So when the city finally stabilized, when democratic government returned and tried to heal, there was a new urgency to control anything that might disrupt. The old wounds made them vigilant, sometimes too vigilant. In 399 BC, 3 citizens stepped forward to accuse Socrates. Meletus, a young poet, perhaps jealous, perhaps sincere. Anytus, wealthy, influential, with personal resentment, and with political instincts sharpened by years of chaos. Lycon, representing the orators and teachers who had been stung by Socrates' questions. The formal charges were shaped carefully: impiety toward the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth. Vague enough to be hard to refute completely, serious enough to carry death. If you slow down and imagine the moment those accusations became public, you can almost feel the city's breath change. In the marketplace, someone whispers it over a basket of figs. In a workshop, a craftsman pauses mid-strike and listens. In a household, a father mutters that it is about time. In another, a young man feels a coldness spread under his ribs. Socrates himself, according to the spirit of the stories, did not panic. He did not run. He did not hide. He continued his routines. He continued to talk. He continued to trust that the examined life is the only one worth living. And that calm, ironically, may have made him look guilty to those who expected fear. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom filled. 500 jurors, a crush of bodies, the hum of expectation. The prosecutors spoke first, painting Socrates as a dangerous subversive. They pointed to the trauma of the 30 tyrants. They pointed to the betrayals of Alcibiades. They suggested that Socrates had helped create the intellectual climate that made tyranny possible. In a city trying to protect itself, that accusation lands heavily. Then Socrates spoke, and instead of pleading, he questioned. If you were standing in that courtroom, you might feel two sensations at once. The first is the thrill of watching a man refuse to perform the expected script. The second is the slow dread of realizing he is not trying to save himself the way most men would. He dismantled contradictions. He asked who improves the youth. He compared education to horse training, insisting it requires knowledge, not vague claims. He pointed out the incoherence of accusing him of atheism and of introducing new divine beings at the same time. And then he spoke of the oracle, of Cherophon, of the mission that had defined his life. He told them he had been sent, like a gadfly, to sting the city into wakefulness. He even suggested that rather than punishment, he deserved public maintenance, a place of honor, not because he wanted comfort, but because he believed his work had been a service to Athens. You can imagine jurors stiffening, some offended, some impressed, some bewildered. A man on trial for his life, and he speaks as if the trial itself is another conversation in the agora. The votes came back, guilty, by a narrow margin. Not unanimous, not inevitable, close enough to hurt. Picture the jurors casting their pebbles, one by one, hands dipping into baskets, faces set in expressions that try to look neutral, stone clicking on stone, a sound so small, yet it decides a life. Socrates stands while it happens. He does not pace. He does not plead with his eyes. He simply waits, breathing in the mixed air of sweat, wool, and sun-warmed dust. When the verdict is read, the room shifts, like a single animal turning. Some men avoid his gaze. Others lean forward as if hoping for a sudden apology that would make mercy easier. But Socrates speaks as he always has, steady, almost gentle, and that steadiness, in such a place, feels like a challenge, even when it is not meant to be. And then came the second phase, the penalty. Under Athenian law, the prosecution proposed death, but Socrates could propose an alternative. This was his chance, a reasonable fine, exile, a gesture of regret, something that would let the jurors choose mercy without losing face. Instead, he continued to speak as if he were still teaching. He proposed, at first, that he deserved honor. Then, pressed, he offered a fine so small it sounded like mockery. Only after friends intervened did he agree to a larger fine. The jurors were not amused. Many who had been uncertain now felt he was contemptuous. The second vote was harsher: death, hemlock. And yet, even that sentence did not happen immediately. A sacred mission to Delos was underway, and executions were forbidden during the festival. The ship had to return before the law could proceed, so Socrates was taken to prison, not for a day, but for weeks. A pause, like the held breath between thunder and rain. After the second vote, the city did not roar. It murmured. Socrates was led away through bright streets, past faces that could not decide whether to stare or look down. The prison air was cooler, stone holding silence like a deep bowl. A single lamp smoked gently. Somewhere, water dripped with steady patience. Friends came. They sat close, hands clasped, and their voices kept breaking into fragments. Some whispered plans for escape, bribed guards, a boat, exile and breath and time. Socrates listened, then asked his usual questions, not to wound them, but to understand what an escape would mean. Could he save his body by breaking the law he had spent his life respecting? Could he teach virtue by acting against his own principles? The waiting lasted because a sacred ship was away, and the city would not execute during the festival. Days passed in slow layers. Dust floated through a high opening. In that pause, the prison became a small hidden agora, and Socrates kept examining the last and largest question, turning it gently, as if it were a smooth stone in his palm. What is death? An ending or a change? Outside, Athens tried to return to ordinary life, yet a thin unease settled over the streets like powdery dust. Inside, Socrates waited, calm enough to feel strange, and steady enough to quiet those who sat beside him. When the ship returned, it would not arrive like thunder. It would arrive like a soft knock, and he would answer it. The prison of Athens was not built to be cruel in the way later ages would understand cruelty. It was simply stone, and stone has its own kind of indifference. It holds coolness. It holds echoes. It holds the smell of old dampness and the faint smoke of oil lamps that have burned through many nights. If you were standing here with me, seated on a worn bench, you might notice how the air feels heavier near the floor, where the chill gathers. You might hear the smallest sounds as if they were magnified. A chain settling, a distant cough, the soft scrape of sandals in a corridor, then silence again. Dust drifts in the light from a high opening, slow as falling snow, and the dust seems to carry the city inside it, as if Athens itself has become powdery and tired. Socrates sits in that dimness the way he sat in the marketplace, not proud, not defeated, just present. His cloak is the same rough cloth, folded around him in a practical way. His feet still touch the ground. He rubs his thumb against his palm sometimes, as if feeling the texture of a thought. The delay before his execution was caused by a festival, a sacred pause. A ship had been sent to Delos to honor Apollo, and the law forbade killing during that time. 30 days, more or less. A month that stretches when you know it has an edge. People came to him, day after day, friends first, because friends are the ones who cannot accept the shape of an ending. They arrived in small groups, their faces drawn, their voices lowered as if loud words might bring the verdict back. They carried news from the city. They carried bread, figs, a little wine. They carried plans. There is always a plan when humans cannot bear what is. A bribe for a guard, a door left unlatched, a boat waiting in the dark, a road out of Attica, a new life in exile. Crito was among the most devoted. I have always found it strange, honestly, how loyalty can become frantic when time becomes short. In the daylight of ordinary days, Crito might have accepted Socrates' arguments with patience. Here, in the prison, patience kept slipping away from him like water through fingers. He leaned close. His hands trembled a little as he spoke. He told Socrates that escape was possible, that friends would risk money and reputation, that the city would not be able to stop them if they moved quickly. He spoke of shame too, the shame of letting a friend die when a door could be opened. Socrates listened. He did not interrupt. He held the silence between Crito's sentences like a gentle cloth, letting it settle. Then he began to ask, "If I escape," he wondered aloud, "what will I be saying about the laws, about the agreements that hold a city together?" If I have benefited from Athens all my life, if I have walked its streets freely, spoken in its spaces, raised my children under its protection, can I now break its rules because they hurt me? Crito answered with anger, with grief, with the simple human fact that the trial was unjust. Socrates did not deny it. He had never pretended the city was perfect. He had questioned it for decades. Yet he returned to the same principle that had guided him through so many conversations. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. To escape would be to commit injustice against the laws, he suggested. Even if those laws had failed him, it would be like striking back at a ship for hitting a rock, as if the wood were guilty. He imagined the laws as voices, speaking to him in the night, asking whether he would honor the contract of citizenship only when it was comfortable. Some people argue about this reasoning, even now. Was Socrates too obedient? Was he making a point? Was he resigned? We cannot be sure. But what we can see through the haze of centuries is the steadiness. He was consistent. He could not bear to save his life by contradicting the life he had lived. And beneath that consistency was another quiet belief, one he spoke of more openly as the end drew closer. That death might not be the worst thing. He spoke about death the way a person speaks about sleep when they are already drowsy, not as terror, but as an unknown that might be gentle. If death is nothing, he said, if it is a dreamless sleep, then it will be like sinking into a dark, warm sea of rest after a long day. No pain, no hunger, no noise, just stillness. And if death is something else, a journey, a passage, then perhaps it is an opening rather than a closing. Perhaps the soul, if it exists, goes on. Perhaps he will meet those he has only heard about in stories, Homer, Hesiod, the heroes of old. Perhaps he will question them too, with the same patient curiosity, asking what courage meant when they stood in the dust of battle, what justice meant when kings gave orders, what piety meant when gods were invoked. You know that feeling when you stand at the edge of a dark room and you cannot see what is inside, yet you sense that the room is still there, waiting? That is the way Socrates seemed to treat death, not as a monster, as a room. His friends struggled with that calm. Some were furious at it. Some found it contagious and began to breathe more slowly in his presence, as if his composure could be borrowed like a cloak against cold. His family came too, and those visits were harder. Xanthippe arrived with tears that did not care about philosophy. The youngest child clung to her. The prison air felt even tighter when a child cried in it, because crying in a stone room is like water hitting rock. It leaves a mark in the ear. Socrates spoke to them softly, yet at some point he asked that they be taken home on the final day, because he did not want their grief to drown the conversation he was having with his friends. That detail is both tender and unsettling. It is like watching someone close a door gently while you stand outside it. Meanwhile, outside the prison, Athens did what cities do. It argued. It moved on. It pretended to move on. Some citizens felt relieved. The gadfly would sting no more. The marketplace could return to easier talk. Young men would stop embarrassing their elders with questions. There was a desire for quiet, for normality. Others felt uneasy. The trial had been close. The vote had been narrow. Some jurors who had voted to convict had perhaps expected Socrates to beg and soften and make their decision easier. Instead, he had remained himself. No, in the days after, that memory gnawed. There is a special kind of regret that arrives after a decision is made and cannot be undone. It arrives like a cold breeze in a warm room. You do not see it, but you feel the skin tighten, and the sacred ship, the one that held his time in suspension, was out on the sea. People watched the horizon for it, not with celebration, with that quiet sense that a line is about to be crossed. Inside, the days continued to stack like thin sheets of paper. Socrates talked. He asked questions. He explored ideas as if he were preparing himself, not by denial, but by understanding. He spoke about the soul, about whether it might be immortal. Plato later recorded these conversations in a way that makes them feel like a last offering, a final weaving of thought before the loom goes still. In the cell, candlelight trembled against the stone. The flame did not roar. It leaned and wavered in the small draughts, painting slow movement onto walls that could not move. Sometimes Socrates would stand and walk a little, just a few steps, feeling the heaviness of his own body, noticing how even a philosopher must deal with knees and ankles and breath. The sound of his bare feet on stone was soft, almost like a whisper. He would sit again. He would smile at a friend. He would ask another question. On the final nights, I imagine the city sounded farther away, as if the prison walls had thickened. The sense of time changed. Minutes could become long. A sigh could seem like a whole paragraph. And then, one morning, the air shifted. A messenger came, perhaps, or the jailer's expression changed. The ship had returned from Delos. The sacred pause was over. The law could proceed. It was not announced with drums. It was announced with the quiet finality of a door closing. The day that had been waiting at the end of the month had arrived. Socrates received the news as he received all things, with attention, with steadiness, with that curious calm that made his friends look at him as if he were already halfway elsewhere. They gathered in the cell that morning. They sat close. They spoke in low tones. Outside, sunlight fell on Athens, and dust floated in it, and the city breathed as if it did not know what it was about to do. But inside the prison, the conversations continued, and in them, you can feel a strange gentleness. A man facing death is speaking about life as if he is still responsible for it, still willing to examine it, still willing to turn dread into a question. And the cup, somewhere beyond the door, waited. Before that final morning, there was an aftertaste in the city, a lingering bitterness that the verdict had been so close. 220 had wanted him free. 280 had wanted him condemned. Numbers like that do not feel decisive. They feel like a cracked cup held together by habit. And then, when the penalty was chosen, the crack widened. More men voted for death, as if his refusal to flatter them had offended something tender in their pride. It is strange, from far away in time, how easily a crowd becomes harsher when it feels mocked, even if the mockery is only the sound of integrity. Socrates spoke in prison of how it had happened, not to rehearse his pain, but because the sequence mattered. The charges had been crafted to sound simple and heavy. Impiety toward the city's gods, corrupting the youth, vague enough to cover almost anything, sharp enough to kill. When his accuser claimed that all Athenians improved the young except Socrates, he compared it to horse training. Skill is rare, he suggested, not universal. When they called him an atheist and also accused him of introducing new divine beings, he pointed to the contradiction with a calm that made it feel almost obvious. And when he told the story of Delphi, of the oracles saying no one was wiser, he admitted his own bewilderment, then described how he had questioned politicians, poets, craftsmen, until he found the odd wisdom of knowing he did not know. Behind it all was his daimonion, that quiet inner sign he spoke of, the warning that sometimes stopped him from taking a step. Some Athenians heard that and shivered, as if a private whisper were being treated as a god. Yet Socrates described it without drama, more like someone describing a familiar pause in the mind. And in these final weeks, it did not stop him from staying. Its silence felt, to him, like permission. The prison had a small basin of water in a corner, not clean enough to taste like a spring, but enough for washing hands, for wetting a cloth. Now and then a visitor would dip fingers into it, and the sound of that small water movement would be louder than it should be, as if the whole room listened. Water has always been like that in stone rooms. It makes a soft statement. Socrates would wash his hands slowly, rubbing them together, letting the water run along the lines of his skin. A simple action, yet when time is short, the simplest actions become weighted. A hand lifted, a drop falling, a cloth wrung out. Movements that remind you the body is temporary, even when the mind is busy with eternity. As the day approached, the talk of escape became more desperate. Plans were repeated, refined, argued over. The same words said again and again, as if repetition could create reality. Socrates remained steady. He suggested that running would teach his students the wrong lesson. If he escaped, then his whole life of urging others to value virtue over convenience would become a performance, a clever mask. He would rather have his body end than have his teaching collapse. Time moved. The sacred ship moved. Somewhere out on the sea, it cut through water, leaving a line that vanished behind it. And then, at last, the ship returned. Even before anyone said the words, you could sense the change. Like a candle flame leaning when a door opens, like the city drawing one deep breath. The day had come, and in the hush of that morning, with dust floating through the light and water resting in its basin, the conversation turned, naturally, to the thing no one can avoid forever: how to meet the unknown with a steady heart. One of his friends noticed, that morning, the way the light fell across Socrates' face, catching the fine lines near his eyes, turning even the roughness of his features into something gentle. Another friend listened to the corridor, to the faint clink of keys, and felt his own stomach tighten. Socrates only breathed, slow, even, as if he were matching his breath to the steady pulse of the city beyond the walls. When the jailer came, he did not come like an enemy. That detail always stays with me. The man had a job, shaped by law and custom, and he stepped into the doorway with a face that looked tired rather than triumphant. The corridor outside the cell held a little draft, and the flame of the lamp leaned. Footsteps approached, paused, then the soft scrape of the door. Socrates looked up. There was no sudden shout, no rough handling. The city did not need to add cruelty to what it had already decided. Athens preferred its punishments to appear orderly, even dignified, as if dignity could be poured over a tragedy like oil over water. The jailer spoke quietly. The ship had returned. The time was finished. The sentence could be carried out. Socrates nodded, the way you might nod when someone reminds you of an appointment you have been keeping in the corner of your mind. His friends, gathered around him, shifted like reeds in wind. Someone swallowed hard. Someone stared at the floor. And then, because he was Socrates, he began to talk again, not to delay, not to bargain, simply because thought was what he offered the world, and he would not stop offering it just because the world had asked him to stop. They spoke that morning about the soul, not as a lecture, but as a shared hush. The room felt as if it had narrowed, bringing everyone closer. Candlelight wavered on stone. Dust drifted in the shaft of sun. The basin of water sat still in its corner, a small, dark mirror. Socrates suggested that if the soul is more than breath and blood, if it belongs to a deeper order, then death might be a separation rather than an annihilation. He offered reasons, analogies, the kind of careful steps he always took, as if he did not want to slip into comfort or fear. Some scholars argue about what parts of these final conversations were exactly his, and what parts were later shaped by Plato. It is debated. Yet the mood is clear, even through uncertainty. Calm inquiry at the edge of the unknown. At some point, the jailer returned with the cup. Not a jeweled goblet, a simple vessel, practical. Inside was a liquid made from hemlock, a poison that would slowly numb the body from the feet upward until breath stopped. It was considered a citizen's death, not the public spectacle of a slave's execution. That is another unsettling thing about Athens. It could make death neat. Socrates took the cup in his hands. If you were here, you might notice his fingers. They are not delicate. They are the fingers of someone who once worked stone. who once held a shield, who has always been in the world physically. He held the cup steady. He looked at it without flinching. He asked whether he could pour a libation, a small offering to the gods. The answer came softly. There was only enough for the dose. Socrates accepted that without irritation. He lifted his eyes, as if seeing something beyond the ceiling, and offered a quiet prayer instead. Not for rescue, but for a good journey. Then he drank. One steady motion, no hesitation, no grimace meant for drama, just the simple act of swallowing, as ordinary as taking water on a hot day, except for what it meant. His friends broke. Some turned away. Some covered their faces. The room filled with a sound that was not speech, not quite sobbing either, more like breath losing its shape. Socrates, gently, reminded them to be calm. It is hard to hear that and not feel both comforted and disturbed. Comforted because he was trying to soothe them, disturbed because he had to. He stood after drinking, because the poison works best when the body moves. He walked around the cell slowly, as if he were strolling through the agora, bare feet on stone. A soft slap, then another, then another. Each step seemed to measure time. He spoke while he walked, not constantly, but in small comments, curious observations, little notes about sensation. He said his legs were becoming heavy. He said it felt as if a sleep were rising from the ground. When his knees began to weaken, he lay down on the mat. The jailer came near and touched his feet, testing for numbness. It is a tenderly clinical gesture. The jailer asked him to keep still. Socrates obeyed, not like a prisoner obeying a guard, but like a patient listening to a healer. The numbness climbed, feet first, then the calves. The lower legs felt like stone. The sensation moved upward, and Socrates described it as if he were describing weather, a cold line rising, a quiet boundary crossing. His breathing remained even. He did not fight. He did not perform. He simply attended. As the poison reached higher, he covered his face, perhaps because the light had become too sharp, perhaps because it was his way of withdrawing gently from the gaze of those he loved. And then came the last words. He turned his head slightly. His voice was faint but clear enough. He spoke to Crito. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt, and do not neglect it. A rooster to the god of healing. That final image lingers like candle smoke in the air. Was he suggesting that death was a kind of healing, a cure for the fever of life? The meaning remains debated, but the gesture feels intimate. A small, practical instruction at the edge of eternity. A reminder that even in the grandest moments, humans are still humans, tied to tiny debts, tiny rituals, tiny promises. After that, he was still. Crito closed his eyes. The room went quiet in a way that felt like the world holding its breath. Outside, Athens continued. Carts rolled. Dogs barked. A vendor called out. Somewhere, water moved in a fountain. The city did not stop moving just because one man stopped breathing. Yet something did change. Not immediately. Not like thunder. More like a slow shift in temperature. Some citizens felt relief, and their relief had an uneasy edge, as if they had swallowed something bitter. Others, almost at once, felt regret. The execution did not erase Socrates. It sharpened him. The man who had walked barefoot through the marketplace was now fixed in memory, unchanging, as if death had turned him into a statue, the kind his father once carved from marble. The three accusers, for a time, tasted the city's mood turning against them. People began to speak of injustice, of shame. The story spread that Athens, proud of its wisdom, had killed its wisest citizen and his students. His students felt the ground move under them. Plato, especially, carried the shock like a stone in the chest. He had been born into privilege, into the kind of family that expected politics, influence, a respectable life. Yet the prison had shown him something else. It had shown him that the city could be wrong, and that the wrongness could be lawful. So he turned away from politics. He turned toward preservation. Since Socrates had written nothing, the memory of him was fragile, like a flame in wind. Plato began to write dialogues, not dry treatises, but conversations that could hold a voice. He brought Socrates back to life on the page, letting him question again, letting him confuse and clarify, letting him guide others into that productive not knowing. Xenophon wrote too, in his own way, more practical, more grounded. Other followers carried fragments of the man, each holding a different angle of the same light. Soon, the influence widened. Some took Socrates' simplicity and made it harsher, living with deliberate poverty, shocking respectable citizens. These were the cynics, who treated convention like a garment to be thrown away. Others took his focus on virtue and turned it into a disciplined practice of inner strength. The Stoics. Others took his confession of ignorance and turned it into a philosophy of suspended judgment. The skeptics. Each group claimed to be his heir, and perhaps each was, a little. Socrates had not been a system. He had been a method, a way of living in questions. As Greek culture spread beyond Athens, his shadow traveled with it. Roman thinkers found him and admired the way he made virtue practical. Lawyers found him and admired the way he used questions to expose contradictions. Teachers found him and discovered that asking can be more powerful than telling. And then, later, centuries later, others found him too. Religious thinkers who saw in his death a kind of martyrdom. Reformers who saw in his stubborn conscience a model. Scientists who recognized that a hypothesis is just a question wearing a laboratory coat. Even in our own time, when information pours into us like rain, his old lesson still holds. Confidence is not the same thing as knowledge. The unexamined life can pass like a sleepwalk, and the examined life, it can be quiet, attentive, a steady candle in a room that wants to go dark. If you listen closely, you can almost hear him in the distance, not as a ghost, but as a habit of mind. A soft voice in the middle of the noise asking, "What do you mean by that?" Tonight, by this fire, we are not here to argue like jurors. We are here to let the questions become gentle, to let the edges of the story soften, to let the mind loosen its grip. So take a slow breath in, hold it for a moment, let it go. Imagine Athens fading into dusk, marble columns cooling, the agora emptying, footsteps becoming fewer, the last voices turning into murmurs. Imagine the prison stone growing quiet again, dust settling where it wants, water resting in its basin. And in that quiet, the figure of Socrates becomes less a tragedy and more a kind of calm presence. A reminder that even the darkest decisions of a city can be met with a steady heart. And as your thoughts drift, we can follow the ripple of his life a little farther into the long centuries where his questions keep walking softly from mind to mind. It is almost comforting, in a strange way, to think of ideas traveling like dust. You cannot hold dust firmly. You can only notice where it settles. Socrates settled into minds the way fine powder settles on a shelf you did not know existed. After Athens, his questions moved to other cities, carried by students and scrolls. In Rome, where law became a kind of public theater, a lawyer learned that the sharpest argument is sometimes a sequence of calm questions that leaves an opponent nowhere to stand. Centuries later, when Christianity spread through the empire, some thinkers looked back at Socrates with complicated affection. They recognized a familiar shape in his life, a man choosing death rather than betraying conscience, a man speaking of the soul as if it mattered more than the body. In medieval universities, students sat in cold stone halls that smelled of ink and damp wool, and they learned a method that feels close to the agora. Pose a question, consider objections, respond carefully. The room would be quiet except for pages turning and a voice asking, "What do we mean when we say this is true?" During the Renaissance and the Reformation, The tension between authority and conscience grew sharper, and Socrates became a symbol again, not because history repeats neatly, but because the human heart recognizes the same dilemma in new clothing. Then came the scientific revolution, when people began to question nature directly, through observation and experiment. The old habit of inquiry found a new stage. A hypothesis became a question. An experiment became the test of whether a belief could stand. Even modern therapy carries a faint Socratic scent to it. Cognitive behavioral therapy often uses gentle questioning to help a person notice the thoughts that hurt them, then test those thoughts for truth. The guide does not pour in answers. They ask, they wait. They help you give birth to clearer seeing. And now, in our age of screens, where words arrive faster than breath, his warning feels even more tender. We mistake confidence for knowledge. We carry opinions like stones and think the weight proves they are true. Socrates would have asked, "What do you mean by that? How do you know?" So the story does not end in the prison. It becomes a slow river. It runs through courtrooms and classrooms, through quiet bedrooms, where a person lies awake and wonders whether they have lived well. It runs through every moment when someone chooses integrity over convenience or curiosity over pride. And as you listen, letting your breathing deepen, you can imagine that river, dark water under moonlight, a steady sound far away, like the sea beyond Athens, like time itself moving without hurry. The questions keep flowing, and we can keep following them, softly, into the next hush of the night. Even the newest questions about artificial intelligence and about voices that can be generated without a living throat would have amused him, I think, not because he would fear them, but because he would ask what understanding truly is, and whether a well-shaped sentence is the same as wisdom. Those questions can feel heavy, so let them float, like ash lifting from a fire, rising and thinning until it is only a soft gray trace in the air. The river of Socrates' questions did not rush. It never needed to. It moved the way underground water moves, patient, unseen, wearing down stone by simply being there. Sometimes I picture a library at dusk, long after the last footsteps have faded, when the air is still and the pages seem to breathe. Scrolls and codices, papyrus and parchment, ink that has darkened with age. A lamp burns low. The flame is small, but it holds a circle of light that feels like a private world. Inside that circle, a reader leans close, tracing words with a fingertip, as if touch might help understanding arrive. In that moment, Socrates is alive again, not as a man, but as a method. A question forms in the reader's mind, gentle at first, then sharper, then gentler again. The question is not meant to wound, it is meant to clear the fog, and if the answer is uncertain, that is not failure. It is the beginning of honesty. You know that feeling when you wake up in the middle of the night and your thoughts are too bright, too fast, as if someone lit a lantern inside your skull? Socrates would have recognized that. He might have suggested that the lantern does not need to be blown out with force. It only needs to be lowered, dimmed, made softer. The way candlelight becomes friendlier when you shield it with your hand. In the centuries after his death, people carried his questions into new rooms. In Rome, lawyers learned that truth can be approached by narrowing a path with careful inquiry. A witness speaks. Another question follows. A contradiction appears, quietly, like a crack in a cup. The crack does not shout. It simply is. A thoughtful mind sees it and cannot unsee it. In cold university halls, students held their hands near braziers, turning fingers toward warmth, and learned to dispute, to consider objections, to shape arguments. The structure was different from the agora, more formal, but beneath it was the same heartbeat. Do not accept a claim simply because it is spoken with authority. Examine it, test it, hold it up to the light. I have always found it strange that Socrates, who wrote nothing, became the reason so many people wrote. It is as if his silence created a hunger. His refusal to leave a neat system behind forced later minds to keep moving, to keep searching, to keep wondering. Even now, his shadow reaches places he could never have imagined. A courtroom where a careful question exposes a hidden inconsistency. A classroom where a teacher refuses to hand over an answer too quickly. A quiet office where someone is guided through their own thoughts until the fog thins and a clearer sentence appears. We live in a time when words can be produced quickly, when confidence can be performed like theater, when information arrives in endless streams. It is tempting to confuse volume with wisdom, speed with understanding, expression with truth. The temptation is not new. Only the machinery is new. If Socrates were here, I think he would still prefer the pause. The pause is where the nervous system loosens. The pause is where breath becomes audible again. The pause is where you remember you are alive. So tonight, as we sit in this dim room, listening to the faint crackle of the fireplace, let the story return from distant centuries to a simpler place, back to a stone cell in Athens, back to the last cup, back to the moment when a man's life ends and his influence begins. There is another image I keep returning to, and it has the quiet weight of clay in the hands. It is the sacred ship slipping away from Athens toward Delos. While it is gone, the city holds its breath, because the law says no executions during the festival. A strange mercy, not born of pity, but of ritual, yet mercy all the same. Picture the harbor before sunrise. The water is dark, almost black, with thin bands of silver where the first light touches it. Ropes creak. A gull calls once, then falls silent. Men move with sleepy precision, checking knots, speaking in murmurs that do not quite wake the day. The ship rocks gently, like a cradle, and the sound of its hull against the pier is soft and repetitive, a rhythm that could lull you if you stood there long enough. Inside the city, time stretches. In the prison, Socrates has days that are all the same shape, yet never truly identical. A shaft of light shifts across the floor, creeping from one stone to another. Dust floats inside it, tiny particles rising and falling, as if they are practicing their own slow philosophy. The air smells of damp stone and old wood, and sometimes, if a visitor brings bread, there is a brief warmth of yeast and flour, a reminder of ordinary life, continuing beyond these walls. Friends arrive with plans that sound like rescue. Bribes, doors left unlatched, a boat waiting in shadow. Their voices tremble with hope and with fear. Socrates listens, and then, softly, he begins to ask the questions that undo the plan without humiliating the planners. If we break the law to escape, do we harm the law itself? If we harm the law, do we harm the city? If we harm the city, do we harm ourselves? Some scholars argue that his refusal to flee is the purest expression of his teaching. Others say it is stubbornness, even pride. We can't be sure what was in his heart. We only have the words preserved by those who loved him. And love, as you know, can polish a story until it shines. Still, the mood rings true. A man who spent his life saying it is better to suffer injustice than to do it would find it difficult to run away from a sentence, even a sentence he believed unjust. And then, one morning, the ship returns. The news travels like wind through olive leaves. A whisper at first, then certainty. The festival is over. The law can take its course. Socrates spends his last hours in conversation, not about pleading, about the soul, about death, about what it might mean, if anything, to be separated from the body, to be released from the constant demands of hunger, thirst, pain, desire. If death is nothing, he suggests, then it is like a dreamless sleep, peaceful, a blankness without fear. If death is a journey, then perhaps it is a road to another place where the great figures of the past can be questioned. Imagine that. Homer, Orpheus, Achilles, all sitting in a quiet hall, and you, with your ordinary questions, allowed to speak with them. It is a strange comfort, this image of the afterlife as another dialogue. Then the cup arrives, not with thunder, with the simple sound of a man's footsteps. A cup heavy in the hand, liquid bitter, a smell of crushed plant and cold water. Socrates takes it without trembling. He asks if he may pour a libation, a small offering. The guard says there is only enough for the dose. Socrates nods. He offers a prayer in words we do not fully know, and then he drinks. Time stretches toward an ending. He stands. He walks a little, because movement is allowed, because it helps the body accept what is happening. Bare feet on stone, a slow circle of steps. The sound is small, almost like a metronome. When his legs grow heavy, he lies down. Someone adjusts a cloth. Someone's hands hover, unsure whether to touch him. The air is thick with breath and the faint scent of smoke from somewhere beyond the bars. And then there are words, odd and simple. A rooster, he says, a debt to Asclepius, the god of healing. It is debated what he meant. Some hear gratitude, as if death is a cure for the fever of life. Some hear a final act of ritual. We can't be sure. But I like the possibility that, in his mind, the act of dying was not only an ending, but a release, a loosening, a healing in the sense that struggle stops. Soon after, the city begins to change its mind. Quietly at first, regret is a slow substance, like mud settling at the bottom of water. At first, the water looks clear. Then you notice the cloud. Perhaps we should not have done it, people begin to say. Perhaps we killed the wrong man. Perhaps we were afraid of our own questions. That is the tragedy at the heart of his story. A community so proud of its freedom, deciding that one stubborn conscience was too dangerous to keep alive. Yet even that tragedy softens when you look at what happened next, because the silence did not last. The questions escaped the cell. They seeped into writings, into schools, into minds. The city could end a life, but it could not end an idea. As your eyes grow heavier now, let this be the last feeling you carry from Part 7. Not the bitter cup, not the verdict, not the fear. The ripple, a quiet ripple moving outward, across centuries, across rooms, across conversations, until it reaches even this moment, even this dim firelight, even your own gentle breathing, and then continues, softly, into the next part. If you were standing here with me, you would hear how the room itself changes when a story reaches this point. The crackle of the fire becomes slower, spaced out. The air feels heavier, not with fear, but with quiet. Candle wax warms and releases a faint, sweet smell. Shadows lean in and then lean away again as the flame shifts. It is easy, in histories like this, to focus on the courtroom, on the votes, on the argument, on the cup. Those are the sharp edges. But I want you to notice the softer surfaces too, the ones that hold you rather than cut you. The stone of the prison wall, cooled by night. The thin blanket, rough with age, that someone has folded and refolded until the creases look like rivers on a map. The little bowl of water in the corner, where a few grains of dust drift like tiny boats, turning slowly whenever someone moves. The sound of sandals in the corridor, fading, returning, fading again. These details matter because they make the scene human, and when a tragedy becomes human, it becomes less like a monster and more like weather. Dark, yes. Real, yes. But not something with claws. Something that passes through and then passes on. And when it passes on, it leaves a kind of calm behind it, like the calm after rain when the streets are still wet and the world smells clean. Socrates, in this last stretch, is not trying to win. He is not trying to dominate. He is not trying to escape. He is simply being what he has always been. A man who will not pretend to know what he does not know. A man who will not stop asking what a good life is, even when that question seems to cost him everything. Honestly, that steadiness is the part that stays with me. Not the drama, the steadiness. I think of it as a slow, reliable heartbeat in the dark. You can place your attention on it, the way you might place your attention on the rhythm of your own breathing, and it can guide you toward rest. So let's do that now. Notice the way your breath arrives without effort. Notice the small pause at the top of the inhale. Notice how the exhale feels like a letting go. If thoughts rise, let them rise. If they drift, let them drift. You do not have to chase them. You can watch them the way you might watch the dust in a shaft of light, floating up, floating down, never urgent. The ancient city outside the prison continues, even in your imagination. I want you to hear it softly, like sound from another room, a distant fountain, a dog turning once before lying down, the faint rattle of a shutter in wind, the low murmur of late voices, then silence. Somewhere, far away, the sea breathes. The harbor water lifts and falls against stone, as if the whole coastline is sleeping. And within all that, within the ordinary hush of a night that does not care about verdicts, the questions remain, but they no longer press. They simply exist, like stars. What is courage? What is justice? What is wisdom? They drift above the rooftops. They reflect faintly on the water. They pass through generations of minds, but they do not have to enter yours tonight in any demanding way. You can let them become a background hum, the way a fire hums when you stop listening for individual pops and start hearing only warmth. In the next part, we will step closer to the final moments, not to make them harsh, but to make them gentle, to let them dissolve into the same quiet that holds every life when it ends. For now, just stay here, with the ripple. Stay with the dim light. Stay with the slow, steady breath of time, moving onward. The next part of the ripple is quieter still, because it moves through absence. After the cup has been emptied, after the footsteps in the corridor have turned away, after the last conversation has thinned into silence, there is a gap that cannot be filled, a space where a voice used to be. Athens was full of voices, always, shouting in the assembly, bargaining in the marketplace, laughter spilling from doorways. Yet, there is a special kind of silence that appears when someone who never stopped speaking is suddenly gone. It is not a dramatic silence. It is the silence of people realizing they will not be questioned anymore, at least not by that particular man, in that particular way. If you were walking through the agora a few days later, you might notice it as a small change in the air, a pause when someone makes a confident claim, a slight hesitation, as if a mind expects a familiar sting and then remembers the sting has been removed. The horse feels no gadfly. The horse relaxes, and yet the relaxation carries its own unease, because when the sting is gone, sleep returns. And sleep, in a city like Athens, can be dangerous. I have always imagined Plato in those days like someone carrying a fragile bowl of water through a crowded street. One jostle, and it spills. One careless movement, and it is lost. His teacher had left no writings, no neat stack of scrolls to protect him from forgetting. Everything lived in memory, in the tone of a question, in the way Socrates would tilt his head, in the long, patient pauses after an answer, in the gentle pressure of another question arriving. Memory is a strange thing. It is soft, and it changes shape. It can be faithful and still be imperfect. So Plato begins to write, not as a historian, not as a clerk recording facts, but as an artist trying to trap a living voice inside ink. He chooses dialogue because dialogue is motion. It breathes. It allows uncertainty. It allows a question to remain a question. In the quiet of a room, he scratches at a wax tablet, then later transfers words to papyrus. The sound is tiny, a stylus tapping, a reed pen gliding. Outside, the city continues. Inside, the teacher returns, line by line, scene by scene. It is comforting, in a way, to know that grief can become preservation, that a wound can become a vessel. Xenophon writes too, more practical, more grounded, wanting to show Socrates as decent, loyal, almost ordinary. Others take different pieces and build different houses from them. The cynics take the simple cloak and the bare feet and turn them into a whole life. The Stoics take the steadiness and the moral discipline and shape a path. The skeptics take the confession of ignorance and let it widen into a philosophy of suspension. Each school claims the inheritance. It is almost funny, in a soft way, like listening to children argue over who knew the grandfather best. And yet, it is also beautiful, because it means the voice did not die. It fractured. Yes, it multiplied. It became many voices, all asking, in their own accents, the same old questions. As Greek culture spread after Alexander, Socratic ideas traveled in bags and heads, in copied texts, in conversations at dinner tables, in lectures held beneath colonnades where the wind moved through stone and made a low singing sound. In Rome, Cicero admired the method and turned it into rhetoric. The courtroom became another kind of agora, and a careful question became a tool that could reveal hypocrisy without raising a sword. Later, when new faiths rose and old gods dimmed, some Christian thinkers looked back at Socrates and saw a figure who felt strangely familiar. A man guided by a voice. A man who valued the soul more than the body. A man who accepted death rather than betray what he believed was true. It is debated how fair these comparisons are, but the comparisons themselves show the reach of his example. Through the medieval centuries, his influence moved like a hidden stream beneath the ground. In the scholastic debates of universities, questions were posed, objections listed, answers tested. The method changed clothes, but the bones remained. Then, as the world turned again, Renaissance scholars dusted off ancient texts with careful fingers. The Reformation questioned authority with a sharpness that echoed old Athenian tensions. The scientific revolution asked the world itself to explain its claims, and nature was made to answer through experiment. Socrates would have been amazed by telescopes, by microscopes, by machines that can measure time more precisely than any sundial. But I think he would have recognized the deeper impulse. Do not accept a story because it is comfortable. Ask, test, look again. Even therapy, in our own time, uses a gentle version of his art. A person arrives tangled in thoughts, convinced the knots are unchangeable. A therapist asks a question. The person answers. Another question follows. A contradiction appears, not as shame, but as possibility. The mind loosens. A new thought is born. That is midwifery too. And now, here is the softest truth inside the darker one. The city that killed Socrates did not kill questioning. It only made questioning more sacred. Martyrdom has that strange effect. It turns a life into a symbol. It sharpens the outline. It makes the story portable. Athens learned too late that some things grow when you try to cut them down. For a while, people felt relief. The troublemaker was gone. The awkward conversations could end. The old rhythms could return. But then, regret began to seep in. And regret is like water. It finds cracks. It spreads. It dampens the pride that once felt so solid. Within a few years, many Athenians began to speak of the trial as a mistake. The three accusers, once confident, became targets of resentment. Accounts differ about what exactly happened to them. We can't be sure of every consequence, but we can be sure of the shift in mood. Shame had arrived, quietly, like fog rolling off the sea. And then, the larger consequence, the one that matters most for our long sleep story, philosophy became a discipline, not a hobby, not a performance, a way of living. Socrates left behind no temple, no army, no monument of marble. Yet he left behind a method that could build invisible structures in the mind, the kind of structures that hold when fear arrives, when crowds roar, when authority demands obedience without reason. The examined life, he said, is the one worth living. That sentence can sound sharp in daylight. At night, beside a fire, it can sound different. It can sound like an invitation to gentleness, because examination is not the same as punishment. Examination can be soft. It can be the way you look at your own thoughts and say, "Oh, that is what I have been carrying. That is what has been making me tired." And then you set it down. If you've ever had a worry that felt huge in the dark and small in the morning, you already understand a little of Socratic wisdom. Night magnifies illusions. Daylight reveals proportions. Socrates spent his life trying to bring a kind of daylight into the mind, not with harshness, but with steady attention. So let us end where we began, not in the courtroom, but in the act of listening. Imagine again the cramped Athenian court, 500 jurors, faces close together, the smell of bodies and stone, the noise swelling like surf. Imagine the old man standing there, barefoot, not beautiful, not powerful, not protected, carrying only the stubborn calm of someone who will not lie about what he knows. Then let that image soften. Let the edges blur. Now imagine the prison cell, quieter, a patch of light on the floor, dust floating in it, friends seated close, a cup in a hand, a breath taken, a breath released. Let the scene dissolve further, as if it is turning into smoke. Now imagine a long corridor of time, centuries laid out like stones in a road. On each stone, a person pauses and asks a question. A student, a lawyer, a scientist, a teacher, a tired parent, a lonely thinker. The question is not always the same, but the gesture is pause, ask, listen. Notice what you do not know, and then, very gently, continue. If you want, you can let your own mind practice that gesture now, not on big ideas, not on complicated problems, but on something simple and kind. What does my body need in this moment? It needs rest. What does my breath need? Nothing. It already knows. What does my mind need? Permission to drift. So give it that permission. The fire is low now. The candlelight is softer. The room feels farther away, as if you are already stepping into sleep and the world is turning down its volume for you. Let any last thoughts pass like distant footsteps in a museum hallway, fading, fading, until there is only hush. And in that hush, the story of Socrates becomes what it was always becoming. A slow lullaby about integrity, about humility, about the strange peace that can appear when a person refuses to pretend. I like to think of the oracle at Delphi too, because that is where the thread began. In a sense, a friend asking a question, a priestess answering in a way that could not be easily believed. The whole life that followed was Socrates trying to test that answer without rage, without vanity, simply by walking from person to person and asking, "What do you mean?" There is a quiet lesson in that beginning. When something troubles you, when a sentence lodges in your mind like a splinter, you can either scratch at it until it becomes a wound, or you can approach it slowly, with curiosity, and let the splinter rise to the surface on its own. That is what he did, and that is what we can do with our own thoughts, especially at night. Sometimes, as you lie here listening, your mind may offer you a confident voice, like the politicians in the agora. It says, "I know what will happen. I know what people think. I know what you should have done." The voice sounds certain. It sounds like authority, but certainty is not always wisdom. Socrates would ask, softly, "How do you know?" And if the voice cannot answer, if it can only repeat itself, then you can let it pass. You do not have to argue with it. You do not have to defeat it. You can simply notice its limits and return to the present, to the simple truth of the room you are in. Listen to the small sounds around you. Maybe there is a fan turning, the faint, continuous rush like distant surf. Maybe there is a refrigerator hum, steady, reliable, like a low note held in the dark. Maybe there is only the sound of your own breath and the occasional settling of furniture, wood adjusting, as if the house itself is exhaling. Imagine, if you like, that Athens is far away now, across water and centuries, and yet the motifs remain close, dust in light, water breathing against stone, candle smoke curling upward, footsteps fading into hush, a museum hush too, because history is often kept behind glass. You can stand before an object, a shard of pottery, a worn coin, and feel the distance like a cool draft. But a story, told softly, can make the distance warm. It can bring the human heartbeat back. If you were standing in such a museum, late in the day, when the guards are relaxed and the crowd has thinned, you might hear your own footsteps more clearly. Tap, 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 a rhythm, and between each tap, a small silence. Those silences are where imagination steps in. Those silences are where Socrates might whisper, not with a ghostly voice, but with the simple invitation to look again. Look again at what you thought you knew. Look again at what you fear. Look again at what you assume about yourself. Then, when you have looked, rest. Because a mind that never rests becomes brittle. And Socrates was never brittle. He was steady. He could stand in a loud courtroom and keep his breath slow. He could lie down in a cell and let the end come without panic. That steadiness did not appear by accident. It was trained, moment by moment, conversation by conversation, question by question. You do not have to train that tonight. Tonight, you only borrow it. Borrow the steadiness the way you might borrow warmth from a fire. You do not have to own the fire. You only sit near it and let the heat reach you. So, one more time, let your attention move gently through your body. Forehead smooth, eyes heavy, tongue resting, jaw unclenched, shoulders melting, chest rising and falling, belly soft, hands loose, feet warm. Let the day's arguments, the day's noisy certainties, the day's obligations drift away like smoke leaving a room through a small opening. And if you find yourself thinking about the trial again, about the jurors, about the votes, let it be as distant as thunder heard from far beyond the hills. You know it is there, but it cannot reach you now. Here, in this dim room, you are safe. Here, the only task is to let the story settle, like sediment in calm water, slowly sinking, slowly clearing the surface, until the mind becomes a smooth, dark pond that reflects only candlelight and quiet. That is enough. That is more than enough. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders sink. Let your hands rest, as if they have finally found the exact right place. There is nothing you must solve tonight. There is only the gentle rhythm of time, the quiet breath of the world, the warmth of the fire, and the soft dark beyond the window. Good night.